Now, the Acorn Electron may look like any other 8-bit computer from the 1980s, but it wasn't any ordinary computer. This computer was designed to eliminate the competition in the lower price range, and the one computer it had in its sights was the king of the budget micros in Britain, the ZX Spectrum. If you've read the history of Acorn and Sinclair, or seen the events in the BBC dramatisation Micromen, then you'll know the story, but if you haven't, here's a quick recap of how the rivalry between these two companies began. So Chris Curry, who's one of the co-founders of Acorn, but originally he worked for Sinclair. In 1966, he applied for a job as an engineer at Sinclair Radionics. In 1972, Chris helped the company launch the first electronic calculator, the Sinclair Executive. Sinclair Radionics suffered its first financial loss between 1975 and 1976, and Sinclair sought potential investors to help recover the lost funds. Sinclair eventually worked with the National Enterprise Board, or NEB, which bought a 43% interest in the company. The NEB streamlined Sinclair Radionics' product line, selling off some of their unique innovations, such as their watch and television lines, and brought in Norman Hewitt as the managing director to assist Sinclair. While Sinclair was dealing with the NEB, he could see that there were going to be problems ahead and being restricted on what he was and wasn't allowed to develop. Having his hands tied like this, he came up with a plan. He had Chris Curry, now a former employee, to establish a lifeboat company called the Science of Cambridge Limited. The plan was for Curry to develop the technology ideas from students at Cambridge University. An early product for Science of Cambridge was the Risk Calculator Kit, which helped keep the company financially afloat. By the time that Clive Sinclair had left Radionics and joined Chris Curry at the Science of Cambridge, inexpensive microprocessors had started appearing on the market. Sinclair came up with an idea for selling a microprocessor teaching kit, and in June 1978, the Science of Cambridge launched the MK14, this being the first Sinclair computer. As Clive Sinclair began working on the MK14 successor, Curry was in discussions with Hermann Hauser and opted to leave the Science of Cambridge to co-found the Cambridge Processor Unit Limited in December 1978. Their first product was the Acorn microcomputer, later called the System 1, followed by the Acorn Atom. This started a small rift between the two men, as now Acorn was technically a rival to Sinclair. What really caused the problem was the events that happened in the early 1980s. The British Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC, is paid for by the UK via a TV licence rather than relying on advertising, so they can create and do programmes that educate as well as entertain and not have to worry about investors, commercials, things like that. They decided to launch a computer literacy project, which also coincided with a government incentive done by the Department of Trade and Industry, or DTI, that was designed to help familiarise children in schools with new computer technology. The specification was put out for various computer manufacturers to tender for. Sinclair looked like a strong competitor as its unreleased sequel to the ZX81, the ZX Spectrum, was put forward. However, it didn't meet a lot of the criteria that the program was looking for. Step in the prototype for the Acorn Atom replacement, the Proton. With some adaptation, the computer was able to meet the specs more closely than Sinclair's machine, so the Proton got renamed and released on the 1st of December 1981 as the Acorn BBC Model A and the Acorn BBC Model B. The Model B is the more famous one, being bought by schools as it had 32K of memory. The Model A was a 16K version. The Model A and the Model B were initially priced at £235 and £335 respectively, but this increased almost immediately to £299 and £399 due to higher costs. In today's money, that would roughly be £1,436 and £1,916. In 1982, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum also came in two versions, a 16K and a 48K version. This was priced at £125 for the 16K version and £175 for the 48K version. Allowing for inflation, these would be approximately £553 for the cheaper version and £774 for the 48K version. Due to its lower cost, this made a Spectrum a much more popular computer for the home market, relegating the BBC Model B to schools, businesses, and more wealthier homes. At this point, Acorn, although happy with the sales of the BBC computer, realised they couldn't make the computer cheap enough to compete with the ZX Spectrum, so they decided to create a cut-down version of BBC that could be created at a price point to compete with the ZX Spectrum, while allowing certain amount of compatibility with the full-fat BBC Model B. In 1983, the Acorn Electron was brought onto the market, although there wasn't enough in stock for the Christmas of 1983. This was due to 40 batches of uncommitted logic array chips, or ULAs for short. This chip was in charge of the sound generation, graphics. Using this chip in the Acorn Electron greatly reduced the chip count compared to the BBC Model B, meaning that it could be made for a lower price point. However, due to this first 40 batch, it meant that the Acorn Electron was only in plentiful supply by the middle of 1984, missing the Christmas market, meaning that a lot of kids and households at that time ended up getting a ZX Spectrum or another computer that Christmas. Now, due to the price of computers during this period, most households would only have one computer and wouldn't be buying a second computer. So even though the Acorn Electron was in good supply in 1984, it missed its window of opportunity. Due to the amount of unsold stock, the price of the Acorn Electron was reduced from £199 to just £99, which did get sold, but not at the level of the ZX Spectrum. By the time both of these computers were discontinued, the figures stand at the Acorn Electron selling 200,000 units compared to the ZX Spectrum's 5 million units. With this in mind, we can clearly see Sinclair won. So this is how history stands, but I want to put to you an alternate history. What if on the 1st of December 1981, instead of the BBC Model A coming out with its 16K, there was only the BBC Model B, and the Acorn Electron following several months later in 1982, around the same time as the release of the ZX Spectrum, making it a direct competitor with the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. So now, with an even playing field, could it have beaten the ZX Spectrum and have been the dominant computer that a lot of programmers in the 1980s in Britain would now be saying was the computer that got them into the industry? Firstly, I think we need to compare the specs of the two computers. So we're comparing the basic Acorn Electron against the basic ZX Spectrum 48K version, with no upgrades, expansion modules, etc. So first of all, let's begin with the price. At their release, the ZX Spectrum cost around £175, whereas the Acorn Electron was a slightly higher £199. That's a £24 difference, which is equivalent to around £106 in today's money. So an exceptional price difference, meaning that the Spectrum draws first blood. It's funny the way the power of a computer is judged on different things depending on the time period. In the 1990s it was the amount of bits. The more bits the better. But in the 1980s we're firmly in the 8-bit period, and so now it was based on memory. The more memory, the more powerful, or so we thought back then. So with that in mind, the ZX Spectrum with its 48K compared to the Acorn Electron's 32K, the ZX Spectrum takes the win again. Now for something a little bit more tangible, the processor speed. The Spectrum has a Z80A processor running at 3.5 MHz, whereas the Acorn Electron has an SY6502 that is able to access ROM at 2 MHz and RAM at half the speed at just 1 MHz. So bearing this in mind, the Z80 and the 6502 are different processors. So although it looks like the Z80 is nearly double the speed of the 6502, the way the 6502 works means it can handle a little more per clock cycle compared to the Z80, meaning that speed-wise it's not double the speed, but in this case the Z80 is doing more than the 6502, meaning the Spectrum wins again on processor speed. Now so far it looks like the Acorn is on the ropes, but the Acorn comes back swimming with the first noticeable difference, and one that a lot of consumers would have paid attention to, and that is the 56 key full travel QWERTY keyboard compared to the ZX Spectrum's rubber key membrane keyboard. Next there is a video and sound, with the Acorn Electron offering more video outputs, including RF connection to the TV, as well as a black and white composite output and an RGB video output. Compare that to the Spectrum's RF only output to connect it to a TV, and you're starting to see what that extra £24 is buying you. Resolution now. The Spectrum is offering a resolution of 256 by 192 pixels with a palette of 15 colours. This consists of 8 colours and 7 bright colours. There is no bright colour for black. So with the Acorn Electron, it offers different resolutions, and using the resolution that would give us the maximum amount of colours on the Acorn, which would be 16, the Spectrum wins. The Acorn can only output a resolution in this particular mode of 160 by 256. So the 16 colours on the Acorn consist of 8 colours and 8 flashing colours, so the same colours again but flashing. However, if you go to 4 colour modes, now the resolution can go to 320 to 256, and at 2 colours you can get a 640 by 256 resolution, meaning much higher resolutions can be achieved as opposed to the Spectrum. Also, the Spectrum is almost famous, or rather infamous, for the colour clash. When a character walks past the background, the character will tend to take on that particular colour. Now this can be overridden using software, however, you'll notice a lot of software doesn't do this and there is a lot of colour clash, whereas the Acorn Electron doesn't suffer from this problem. Sound-wise, the Spectrum has a single channel beeper that does an amazing job at creating sound and music, but compared to the Acorn Electron's internal speaker, there's no competition. However, the Spectrum's one channel can offer 10 octaves, which beats Acorn Electron's one channel but only 7 octaves. So in the 1980s, computers were not mainstream. Now both computers had BASIC and they could both use key commands. This saved you having to type out every letter and instead just press one button to enter a command. However, the 1980s was a simple time and people were simple folk back then, and they're used to typing words out completely, as typewriters was still a thing in most offices. On the ZX Spectrum, keywords were the only way. If you type in a command like load for example, the computer will not understand it unless you've used the command key, but to the user these would both look the same, so would cause confusion initially. On the Acorn Electron you can use a command key, or you can just type in individual letters, and this would make it a lot easier for a beginner to type in listings from a magazine however they want, so they can use the command keys or they can just use the individual letters. Probably the worst thing would be if you're a ZX Spectrum owner, you've typed it all in using letters, go to run it, the whole thing doesn't run, you're looking at the listing, you're looking at the screen, everything looks the same, and it would be very confusing to work out what you've done wrong. Eventually, reading the manual, what most kids would have probably done, eventually they would work out what the problem was. However, it would cause a lot of frustration initially. On later versions of the ZX Spectrum, it did allow you to type in individual letters as well as use keywords, but this is the original 48K rubber key version, and this did not have that feature. Another selling point for parents who fell for their "it's for homework" and educational line, when they went to the store, they would have been probably more guided towards an Acorn Electron as opposed to a Spectrum, as that would be the computer that would be more compatible with the BBC Model B and actually allow someone to write basic programs at home on the Electron in BASIC and then be able to run it on the school's BBC Model B, for example. Also, going back to BASIC, both computers do have BASIC, but the BBC BASIC that Acorn uses is far simpler to any other BASIC on any other computer ever. Comments below, please. Seriously though, BBC BASIC is one of the easiest basics for new users to use and to understand, and it's the reason why it's still popular with education. It also allows you to add machine code routines in with your basic code to improve the speed of certain parts of your program. Now kids would probably still want a Spectrum as a home computer, because who wants to be reminded of school? But those that did get an Acorn, it would have meant a higher number of users, therefore more publishers would have produced games for it, and a lot more games would have been ported over to the Acorn Electron. This would have also meant that kids would have had a far greater choice for games and a lot more third-party developers getting involved with that system. So now, if the Acorn Electron was in direct competition and coming out the same time period as the ZX Spectrum was introduced, would it have crushed the ZX Spectrum, making it go the way of many other 8-bit micros of that period? Personally, I think no, and here's my reasoning why it wouldn't. So the Electron, a lower competent machine, would have sold a lot more than it did when it was first released. I think the Spectrum would have still outsold the Electron. Firstly, there's the price. Now £25 was a lot of money in the early 1980s, and as well as the 48K Spectrum, there was also the 16K Spectrum at £125, which allowing for inflation in today's money would be around £600, making it a lot more affordable. Plus also the 16K Spectrum is easily upgradable to a 48K of memory, making it identical then to the 48K Spectrum. So rather than having to wait and save up for a 48K Spectrum, kids could get the 16K, and then if they were still interested in it after 6 months, pay for that upgrade. I would also say that the Acorn Electron would have affected Sinclair sales, probably taking it down from the 5 million number to about 3.5 million to 4 million. And I believe that there would be an increase in the Acorn Electron sales from when it was currently released of 200,000, probably to about 1.5 to 2 million sold. It would have probably impacted sales on other 8-bit computers at that time, such as the Dragon 32, the TI-99, Atari, etc. The other thing to consider that Sinclair was very much boots on ground at this point, making a massive impact with the ZX80 and the ZX81. These were the first computers to sell at the sub £100 price mark, which meant there was a lot more of them at home, meaning that people have built up a reputation. If they're happy with the current computer and it's time to upgrade, you normally buy from the same brand, knowing what you're going to get and an improved version of what you already have. So to summarise then, the Acorn Electron, a fantastic machine that was designed to compete with the ZX Spectrum, and on an even playing field, I believe it definitely would have done better than it did. However, the Spectrum would have still beaten it in overall sales, but also the Acorn Electron wouldn't have met its demise, languishing away in a warehouse until it was drastically price dropped. A sad ending for a great machine. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this. So I'll leave you now with a few comparisons of the ZX Spectrum and Acorn Electron gameplay and abilities, and you'll see that although different machines, they definitely hold their own, and both great machines for the 1980s.